I pray we'll have answers that will make them doff their hearts in admiration for us. We surely won't get any acknowledgement if we only remain spectators. I am to talk about the common good. However, since the topics of the speakers flow from the common good, and the common good is one of the pillars of Catholic social teaching, permit me to briefly lay out the broad contours of Catholic social teaching. You know the Catholic Church in Latin terms. So if you read number 41 of the encyclical Solicitudo Rei Socialis, which is the social concerns of the Church, that document tells us that Catholic social teaching is, and I quote, the accurate formulation of the results of a careful reflection of the complex realities of human existence in society and in international order, in the light of faith and of the Church's tradition. Its main aim is to interpret these realities, determining their conformity with or divergence from the lines of the gospel teaching on man and woman and his vocation. A vocation which is at once earthly and transcendent, and its aim is thus to guide Christian behavior, end of quote. In other words, the Catholic social doctrine places the human person and society in relationship with the light of the gospel. Thus, it focuses on the social question and gives an ethical vision for society. Since its aim is to guide people's behavior, it hopes to give rise to a commitment to justice according to each individual's role, vocation, and circumstances. It is worth noting that the Church considers its teaching, its social doctrine as part of its evangelizing mission. In other words, if you are thinking of evangelization, you can't do away with Catholic social doctrine, since that is the way through which the Church gives that ethical vision for society. If you read the encyclical Mater et Magistra, the Church as Mother and Teacher, we are told there are 3 stages which should normally be followed in reducing social principles into action. First, one reviews the concrete situation. Secondly, one forms a judgment on it in the light of the principles of Catholic social teaching. Thirdly, one decides what in the circumstances can and should be done to implement these principles. These are the 3 stages that are usually expressed in the terms look, judge, and act. So having briefly outlined for you what the social teaching is and how we reduce the principles into action, let me highlight that conversations about the social teaching are usually framed under 7 broad areas: respect for life and dignity, the common good, subsidiarity, solidarity, option for the poor, what Gustavo Gutierrez will call preferential option for the poor, justice, and care for creation. The 2 overarching concepts which bring all these 7 principles together are human dignity and the common good. So I now proceed to my task, that is to talk about the common good. And my approach is more theoretical, since the panelists will now give us the practical implications of this whole concept in the various submissions they make. So according to its primary and broad sense, when we say the common good, we mean the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. Maybe let me take it again. The sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So it means that the common good does not consist in the simple sum of particular goods of each subject of a social entity. Because it belongs to everyone and to each person, it remains common, simply because it is indivisible, and also because it is only together that it can be attained. And together it can be safeguarded to ensure that it remains an effective way of having things done. In understanding the common good, it is proper to situate it in its conceptual space, as was developed by the medieval theologian St. Thomas Aquinas. As you well know, Thomas Aquinas and Augustine have shaped more of the theology of the Catholic Church. According to Aquinas, the common good should be understood in terms of aggregate good of individuals, or not in terms of the aggregate good of individuals, but more than the sum of individual goods. In other words, he wants society to be able to make certain claims on individuals and to help society place its interest over and above private interest or individual goods. So when we talk about the common good, we are looking at a good which is more than the sum of individual goods. In other, if we take all our goods out, there will still be a remainder. And that allows society to make the common good a framework through which it can make demands on every member of the society. So in discussing the common good, Aquinas puts together various common goods in which human beings participate. These include domestic or familial good, the social and civic common good, the good of the universe, and the divine good, which is the common cause and paradigm of all the other goods. Remember, Aquinas is talking as a theologian. As a theologian, his aim is always to make God as the ultimate source of the doctrine of the common good, which philosophers might not approach it the same way. So again, you will see Aquinas contrasting the good of the community with the good of the individual. And he argues it this way, that all who are included in the community stand in relation to that community as parts to a whole. And here I'm reading from Summa Theologiae. He also states that the common good is the end of each individual member of the community, just as the good of the whole is in the end of each part. The common good is the end of each individual member of a community, just as the good of the whole is in the end of each part. Thus, for Thomas, we cannot talk of the good of the individual without thinking first of how the good of the individual fits into the good of the community as a whole. So when he discusses the virtue of prudence, you see him making this point so clearly. He says that he that seeks the good of the many seeks in consequence his own good for two reasons. First, because the individual good is impossible without the good of the common, or the common good of the family, state, or kingdom. Second, because since man is a part of the home and state, he must consider what is good for him by being prudent about the good of the many. For the good disposition of parts depends on their relation to the whole. Thus, Augustine will say that any part which does not harmonize with its whole is offensive. So what is Thomas saying here? Thomas is saying that you can't think of individual good properly construed outside the framework of the common good. And that might sound counterintuitive to how we think of individual good. Because for many people, individual good only means chasing after my dreams without recourse to its effects and consequences on the others. And that is why he will discuss this under the virtue of prudence. And the second point is worth re-emphasizing, that in considering what is good for us, we must be prudent about what is good for the many. And here I'm sure your mind can go straight to discussions about Galamsey and all of that, which I'm sure will be talked about. So it means that in the discussions of common good, as highlighted by Thomas, acts that go against the common good are offensive. And they also go against practical reason. And the first principle of practical reason is that good should be done and evil should be avoided. So, we have two reasons why acts that go against the common good are acts which should not be encouraged. Apart from the fact that they are offensive, they also go against the first principle of practical reason, and that is good should be done and evil should be avoided. In developing this concept of the common good, we are so much emphasizing the good of the whole that sometimes we may be tempted to think that the good of the whole overrides subjective individual good. But it is important to note that Aquinas will argue that the state is not an organism that swallows the individual. Rather, the state exists in order that the individual becomes what God intends him to be. Likewise, the individual seeks the beatific vision but cannot overlook his specific obligations and duties to work for the common good even at his own expense. So that is how he bridges the relationship between individual goods and the common good. That even as you are saying that the state is not an organism that swallows the individual, but it exists to help the individual to achieve his fullest potential, the individual also, as he's seeking the beatific vision, as he's walking towards heaven, as a pilgrim, as a wayfarer, must also not overlook the specific obligations and duties to work for the common good, even at his own expense. In other words, the good of the individual is dependent on the common good, and the common good is also reliant on the individual. So yes, the individual remains of crucial importance, but the individual exists in social relationships, and these social relationships bring to bear both civic and Christian responsibilities on which his activities and decisions rest. So what this means is that once we are thinking about the common good, we tend to think of it as a universal term. But in doing so, we are also called upon to remember that it exists at various levels, from the family to intermediate social groups to associations to enterprises of economic nature to cities to regions to states and to nations and the international realm. So if you are a Christian and you are participating in the common good of which you have no choice but to do, then you have a lot of responsibilities. How are you contributing to the social or the common good at the family level, at the association level, at the business level, at the community level, at the regional level, at the national level? In other words, if we want to be citizens and not spectators, we need to think through the demands that the common good makes on us as citizens of this country. Because the common good is both universal yet specific, it is important to note that It guides the structure of relationships, what we can refer to as a formal cause, but also as a final cause, the end to which all other things are directed. And because of that, there's a sense in which we can see that the common good can also be a moral term. It is a moral prism, a moral standard against which the other goods of the society can be weighed. I was given 15 minutes, but let me end by noting that the common good has implications for the state, for civil society, for individuals. The encyclical Mater et Magistra, the Church as a Mother, tells us that the whole reason of being of the state is the realization of the common good in the temporal order. That is why the state exists. The realization of the common good in the temporal order. And among its duties, the state has to so organize economic activity to ensure that people achieve their fullest potential. Remember, we said that the common good is a sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So the state has that responsibility of creating that environment, that enabling environment, which will allow people to achieve their fulfillment more fully and more easily. In talking about the role of the state, it is important to emphasize that the state must protect the rights of all its people, particularly of its weaker members, the workers, women, and children. The document states that it can never be right for the state to shirk its obligation of working actively for the betterment of the condition of the working man. And since the common good is tied to how the state must organize itself, any citizen who is actively engaged in being a citizen must also recognize its own way of assessing the frameworks with which the state operationalizes the understanding of the common good. The common good requires that we also protect and love our native land. And Pope Francis makes this point so strongly in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti on solidarity and social friendship. To Mary.